Hello, and welcome to the Mid-Ohio Valley Public Forum video podcast, where we feature issues of interest to the Mid-Ohio Valley residents and hopefully those beyond. The coronavirus pandemic changed life quite a bit.
And that was the impetus for the Mid-Ohio Valley Public Forum to come into being. And so here we are still in the pandemic. And so we're here with our socially distanced interviews with people and issues that we hope are of interest to people in the Mid-Ohio Valley.
Today, we're excited to be speaking with Natalie Tennant. She's a West Virginia native. Tennant was born in Fairmont and educated at WVU, where she earned a BA in journalism and an MA in communication. She served as the Secretary of State of the state of West Virginia, who is the Chief Elections Officer from 2009 to 2017. After her tenure, she became the Manager of State Advocacy with the Brennan Center for Justice from 2017 to 2019. She continues to advocate for the American voter, especially those here in her home state of West Virginia.
Hi, Natalie. That is quite a resume. And so we're really excited and thrilled to have you here today to talk to the people about these pieces of legislation that are being proposed around voting rights. And so currently there are two different bills in Congress that impact voting rights, the HR 1, which is For the People Act, and then the HR 4, which is usually talked about as the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And I think a lot of people have confusion about what each of them is and what they are proposing doing. So we'd like you to clear up. How are the bills different? What is each one about? And help us all out here.
Yeah, thank you for letting me be here, because you are exactly right. I will confess and admit that over the last 8 or 9 months, I have been traveling the state and on social media, locally, statewide, nationally, in some regards, talking about especially HR 1, the For the People Act. And I guess I would confess too that, as I talk about it, yes, it's about preserving our freedom to vote. It's about getting rid of partisan gerrymandering. It's about breaking down barriers that are arbitrarily put in place. And at the same time, it's like, well, explain that a little deeper, Natalie. So I get where folks are coming from when it's like, oh, all these titles are being thrown around. And I'd also like to say that this is a really important time. Yes, we've been working on these pieces of legislation over the last, several months, especially hot and heavy, but then, been crafted over the last year or two. And so, but September, this is the middle of September, and I'm not sure when folks are going to watch this, if they'll watch it fresh or they'll pick it up in a couple days. But just know that the middle of September in 2021 and then the next couple of months is very important, because these bills have already passed the House of Representatives and are now in the Senate. So that's one thing that they have in common. I'll talk a little bit about HR 4, even though it's number 4 down the line. It is the VRAA. We know what the VRA is, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and how important it was that it fulfilled the pledge and the promise to our minority community, and truly allowing the right to vote to all our citizens then. And what happened is in 2013, you all are familiar with the Holder versus Shelby case. Shelby County, Alabama. Yeah, we'll just say Shelby versus Holder. And that broke down a lot of the Voting Rights Act, the VRA, especially Section 5, which required some pre-clearance. And what pre-clearance is when a state or a voting jurisdiction, election jurisdiction, an area wanted to make changes, if they were under pre-clearance, they had to get the approval from the Department of Justice, and they were in areas that had evidence and factual evidence and history of discrimination. Now, a lot of times we think of the South, yes, because they discriminated against the Black community. But also imagine this, Arizona was a pre-clearance state. They had to be have pre-clearance allowance and be checked and be given the green light because of Native Americans, so many Native Americans, even Alaska, because of the Eskimos who live in Alaska, to make sure that they're not being discriminated against. And I will tell you that West Virginia was not a pre-clearance state. And as the chief election official for 8 years in West Virginia, yes, it is better not to be a pre-clearance state for several reasons. One, you can have these innovative ideas, and you all know my record of that, of having ideas and innovative solutions, and looking at election procedures and things like that. So it does make it a little bit easier. So if you're a state that have to have required pre-clearance, then it would be more difficult. So anyway, that's what Shelby versus Holder did. It took away some of that in Section 5. So what the John Lewis Voting Rights, VRAA, Voting Rights Advancement Act, so it's expanded, would put some of those requirements back in place, because we saw after 2013, when that part of the legislation was struck down, there was, so many more barriers put in place. You can think of Texas, you can think of I believe Georgia and some other areas where it did, almost immediately become more difficult, and those barriers were put in place because there was no requirement to check in and say, is it okay if we do this? They just went ahead and did it themselves, and there have been lawsuits after lawsuits in Texas because of that. So that's what the John Lewis, and of course, he is so important in our history in West Virginia, in the United States, because of what he did. So it's important that we have the Voting Rights Act, and some people look at it like it's for elections moving forward. As we said, pre-clearance, as we move forward for some of those. So then HR 1, which is also known as SR 1, which is also known as For the People Act, is what is happening right now, what election processes are taking place right now, and what it does is give a national standard of voting rights, of voting access. But now I'm going to throw a wrench into all of this. When senators come back on September 13th, it's not called the For the People Act. There is no from my understanding, and we've been working on this, because we don't call it the For the People Act now. We call it the Joe Manchin Compromise. Are you all familiar with what's taken place? I know you are. Because of all summer long, all spring, all summer working on For the People. Then Joe Manchin, our U.S. Senator, comes out and says, this is why I'm not voting for the people. This was in an op-ed back on June the 6th. We don't even know the date in the Charleston Gazette when it had the editorial. And we were like, this is what you're really saying about this. So then, we picked ourselves up, scraped ourselves up off the ground, and continued. When I say we, it's not Natalie, it's a coalition, it's advocates, it's people all over West Virginia. When you talk about Citizens Action Group, you guys had said you interviewed Common Defense, Working Families Party, Common Cause, a lot of this coalition the young West Virginia young voters representing the Black community. So we've all worked together in a coalition. So we've had our ups and downs, and that was a down moment. But what took place after that editorial came out was the other senators and senatorial leadership in the U.S. Senate said, okay, Senator Manchin, and so did we. Like, if you don't like this, then what do you like? Well, Senator Manchin came out with his ideas. So now this is the compromise that we're working on. All right.
Now, can I clarify something?
Yes, please.
If Manchin's compromise were to make it through the Senate, which I think is a pretty big if, then it would have to go back to the House of Representatives and be voted on again there. Am I correct, or am I not?
Yeah, yes. I mean, that's, and
Okay.
that's, and, you know, federal legislation is different. Like we are all, we're pretty good at state legislation, right? We're pretty good, but that is how it works. Like one side
Mhm.
votes it, then the other side votes, it's not quite there. So you go into conferees. And yes, that's a good catch on that it would go back. But we see it didn't have as big of a struggle as it does in the Senate, because the
Mhm.
House does not have a filibuster either, right? So that's the other thing. And what I do think is interesting that, you know, I've even become more in tune to is, you know, instead of calling it amendments, they call it markup. So, and here's what we need people to remember too. When it passed in like March 3rd over in the House of Representatives, it moved over to the Senate. And people were just like, we don't want this. You know, there were a lot of folks who didn't want it. County clerks in West Virginia, 54 of 55 county clerks said, no, we don't want this. And they sent letters to Manchin and Capito. And it was like, wait a minute, hold the phone. The bill that came over from the House is not the same bill that they are considering in the Senate now, because on the Senate side, Senator Amy Klobuchar is the chair of the Senate rules. So they made all of these changes based on what the county clerks wanted, based on what secretaries of state wanted, gave a longer timeline for implementation on some of these policies and proposals, made sure that the funding was there, took some things out, put some things in, and that was called a markup. We would call it in the West Virginia legislature amendments, but it was called a markup. So that's the whole point. It's like, you know, here we are now in September. That bill that passed the House was even changed a lot in the US Senate, and many amendments that were made in that Rules Committee died on an equal vote, a tie vote. Many passed. Some passed that Senator Capito had put into place. So that's why we're asking folks to really take a look at this. Take a look at what was changed from moving from the House to the Senate. Now it's going to be time to take a look at what Senator Manchin. We already know some of the things that he's proposed. We don't have the full language yet of what the Manchin compromise will be. You know, now that we don't have for the people, we have the Manchin compromise. We don't have the full language of that. But can I share with you just a little bit? Ask me questions. I feel like I'm just talking, and I want to make sure you all are I'm saying what you want to know, if that makes sense.
It seems like voting is, you know, we know there's voting locally, and you mentioned, you know, the county clerks had some issues with the bills, and secretaries of state did. So how do these bills on the federal level impact those state regulations or voting issues, and then like on down to the local level?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And that's ultimately what is most important, right? And when we focus on Senator Manchin, as we have over the last 9 months, he's like the perfect person to be able to wade through this. And I say that because, remember, he was Secretary of State in West Virginia from 2001 to 2005. And during that time, we had a major piece of federal legislation passed. I talked about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. A next big bill that passed was the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, which we all know is the motor voter law that made it easy, more accessible by going through the DMV and being able to get registered to vote. In 2002, the Help America Vote Act passed, and it passed, and it was needed to reform some election administration, because you all know there's one word that caused the Help America Vote Act to come about, and that one word is Florida. And you remember, do you guys remember, Kim?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Hanging
remember.
chads.
Florida and Chad, the hanging chads, the pregnant chads, and the dimple chads, right? And so the Help America Vote Act was introduced. It formed the Election Assistance Commission, which is a federal agency. And it's a federal piece of legislation. Is the federal government running Florida elections? No,
No.
no. So when people want to say, oh, this is a federal takeover, it's like, come on, like, know your history and learn your history. It didn't happen in 2002, 93, or 1965. So, and Senator Manchin knows that. He was part of that once that bill was passed. And actually, as a matter of fact, he expanded it. If you'll remember, when he was Secretary of State, he made sure that we had early voting. He started early voting in West Virginia. And so, Jennifer, when you ask about what's this, this new bill, the Manchin Compromise, formerly known as For the People Act, how's it going to help the states? Well, it's going to give that general access of a national standard. I mean, there are states like Pennsylvania to our north, even New York didn't have early voting. Like, we've had it since 2002. And so Senator Manchin knows that that's what's important. So when we talk specifically about what's in the bill and how that helps states, then you have early voting, a minimum of 15 days and at least 2 weekends. Now, West Virginia has 10 days. And there was a move, we used to have 13, then the clerks wanted fewer days. But we know that we can do 15 days, and we know that it's important. So at least 15 days. Heck, there are some states that do 45 days. I think Ohio does 30 days of early voting. So that,
I know
go ahead.
my son moved here from North Carolina, and he
Yeah.
voted in the last election, and he just went on and on about how much easier it was to vote in West Virginia, because he didn't have to take a whole day off of work, stand in line for hours and hours and hours like he did in Raleigh, North Carolina. So
yeah, and that's some of the focus. And I want to remind people too that there's not just one thing that perhaps fixes that long line. Early voting does it. When you talk about election processes and election administration, there are different components that can make a difference and make it easier. And that's why this bill, some people will say, oh, it's 800 pages. Well, yeah, it's a robust bill, because there might be a lot of things. Some things need fixed, and some things, for West Virginia, it just might need to be tweaked from 10 days to 15 days. That's not difficult. We already done it for 20 years, and we might as well expand it and change it. Another thing, as I'm looking, I want to make sure I go through this. Senator Manchin, we know in his compromise that I just want to get to these few that haven't been talked about, but now that I've talked to, we just had a rally on Thursday, people are like, that's really interesting. Like, states should notify voters about polling place changes at least 7 days in advance. Does that make sense? Why would we want to do that?
Yeah, we actually had that issue here in Parkersburg with the last election. Partially due to COVID, there were some changes, and people went to the wrong polling places, and they found out after waiting in line to vote that they weren't able to vote at that particular location, and they had to go somewhere else. And
correction, they could vote, but it had to be provisional.
Right. Or they had to go to their
the last election. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or they had to change and go to their own precinct.
Right. And that's difficult for people who may not have their own transportation, or in places where public transportation is not an option. And so that's definitely something that we've experienced here locally.
So that's you guys are like, you're explaining it yourselves. Like, you didn't necessarily need me. And this is what I want people to, general public, those listening here, and those who are the naysayers, because I have naysayers all the time. Like, it's easy to vote. I just go and vote, and it's easy. And if you're eligible and you're the word's not eligible. It's almost like, if you're not illegal, then it's easy to vote. And it's like, that's great that it's easy to vote for you, but that's not the case all the time, because right there, if you changed a precinct at the last minute and you ask somebody for a ride, and now that person's taking you to the precinct you thought where you were going to vote, you come out and you're like, this isn't where I got to vote. Do you ask your friend or family member to give another hour to take you to another place? It's a little inconvenient, isn't it? And we're not great with public transportation. And so then Kim brings up provisional balloting, right? Are those votes counted?
So not always.
You
And
can't answer
the other part is if you vote a provisional ballot, all those people like your city council member, if you're voting a provisional ballot and you're in the wrong precinct, you're not going to have that office, to vote for, because your city council member that is not going to be on there because you're in the wrong precinct. Like our city council member, I believe it's only 2 precincts in her district. And so if you end up at the wrong precinct, you won't get the chance to vote for her on the provisional ballot because her name won't be on there.
Some of the state level offices are even
Yeah.
like that, because in cities like Parkersburg, the districts kind of split. And so,
Right.
one district may vote for District 10, and another polling place might vote for District 9. And so you may not actually be voting for the person who is tasked with representing you.
And so is that vote counted at all?
I can't answer that. I'm not sure.
I sit here smug looking, don't I?
Yeah. Tell
And
us.
ticked off at the same time. No, it's not counted.
Right.
I mean, and this is what a thing that is in Senator Manchin's compromise. This is I don't know the official language. We think it might be the language. Ensuring that provisional ballots are counted even if they are filed in the wrong precinct. Now, I get the difference there. Filed is different than voting. Like people will say, well, they don't live in that. They don't live in that area. They shouldn't get to vote for that city council member. Okay, I'll give you that. But still, if I have filed it in a wrong precinct, if I'm voting on a statewide race, am I in the wrong precinct? No. No. How could I be? I mean, couldn't I even be? I mean, we could really get into it. I don't live in Wood County. I couldn't necessarily vote there, but there is a provision, I think, with the presidential election. But think about it. You just talked about it between the 9th and the 10th district. You were talking like that vote won't count right now. But this is why this legislation, Manchin's compromise, is so important, because there are ballots, and this is what gets me. People are like, well, I just went and voted and everybody can vote. But it's like, you don't know what's counted come the canvassing. I don't know if you've all sat through canvassing in Wood County, and there could be some question. It took forever, right? For Wood County was the last county in to canvass. And there were a lot of reasons, right? Illness, COVID, just couldn't make up. So people could be questioning what was going on right there. Anyway, I don't know how many provisional ballots were thrown out. I know that there were nearly 200 thrown out and rejected in Monongalia County alone. And they had some tight races. So, excuse me, my point to that is that those provisional ballots should be counted, especially if you're in your congressional district or you're in your state district. Now, I will have county clerks who say, well, that's just too complicated. That's an administrative and process nightmare. I could see that, but that's a legislative thing that could be changed, because that person is registered, duly noted, duly registered, eligible, not illegal, and all the nasty things that people want to say about them. Why shouldn't their vote count? Now, one solution is election day registration, right? If the precinct has been changed, then you're going to a precinct and it's like, well, you can just get registered here and update your information. Those are some of the things that are in the For the People Act. Manchin doesn't necessarily have election day registration in his compromise, I don't think. Remember, haven't seen the language. I've only seen what he came back out with after his op-ed that he put out. So those are why these are some of the things, and it addresses again, Jennifer, what you're talking about, like what's happening in the states. Well, this bill makes it just an even national standard. And what's wrong with standards? You know, if it's an equal access and going to protect our freedom to vote. And those are some of the things that we need to think about. Like it just you can see what frustrates me when people are like, well, it's easy for me to vote. No, I don't know anybody who's been denied the right to vote. Well, bully for you. It's not you. That's great that you're doing it. I always say that our democracy is only as strong as our most vulnerable voter. It goes back to what Jennifer said. And here's why I want people to think. If you see someone standing for a bus, waiting on a bus, ask yourself, how do they get to the polling place when it's election day? Chances are that bus is not specifically stopping at a polling place. Or if they're waiting on a ride, how are they getting to the polling place? Or if they're walking in the rain to work, ask yourself, how are they getting to that polling place? And so then there's other provisions that are put in place also. We live in a rural state, right? Well, when you're at home and you don't know if you're going to get a ride, why shouldn't you be allowed just to ask for an absentee mail ballot? Why have to come up with an excuse or put the county clerks in a rough situation where they're going to have to question you? I mean, it makes their work harder. If we just had no excuse absentee voting, that would help with the lack of transportation. You see what I mean? So that's in this legislation. And that's why it's not just one thing that I can pick out and say, it's the panacea. It's all of these working together. And that's why we're working so hard to get this compromise done. Any more specifics? I mean, can I talk about a few more things? I know I'm burning up the time. I told you guys I would talk a lot, but here's next on September 16th, the West Virginia Redistricting Committee is coming to Parkersburg, correct? For citizens to come and talk about what they want to see in redistricting. Well, imagine we wouldn't have to travel all over the state if this legislation, and especially if Joe Manchin's compromise passes, because it calls and requires for independent redistricting councils. So if I know that, I don't have to go beg a lawmaker to please be nonpartisan and don't gerrymander an area, if I know that there is an independent commission made up of Republican, Democrats, and independents. So we wouldn't have to do all of this traveling around the state. So that's why this bill and this compromise is so important. And then, of course, getting secret money out of campaigns. Everybody, I mean, when I say everybody agrees, I mean, we know that 79% of Republicans, Democrats, and independents support what was in the For the People Act, and in turn, I believe, will support Joe Manchin's compromise. So these are other things that are so important in this legislation that don't give me a blanket statement like the county clerk says, we don't want the bill. And it's like, clerks, you guys realize you are getting money for security. You are getting extended timelines. You're going to get all of this to lift up and fortify what you're doing as election administrators. And it's like, you just wrote it off like we don't need any of it. And that's not the case.
So does the Manchin compromise have language in it about the dark money, the funding?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it has. There's a Disclose Act, and see what this bill. There were smaller bills like the Disclose Act. There's other ones called different things, and I think they all just went into this bill. So now it looks like it might be, he's putting it in the compromise. But yeah, he does not like the dark money. I don't like to call it dark money. I call it secret money. It's a secret. We don't know where it is. I mean, dark money, what does that really mean? I get it. I know that people, but it's daggone secret money. If you guys gave me $25 for my campaign, I'd have to report it. But if you gave $25,000 to a super PAC or something, I'll never know if you gave it to my opponent or not. Do you see what I mean? That's a secret. You're keeping that from me. Or you're keeping not just me as the candidate, the people,
From everybody.
People shut us aside. It's the general public.
Yeah.
So I have a question with It's a roundabout. So when a person fulfills their duty as a citizen on a jury, there are some regulations that require their employer to allow them to do that. I know that in Wood County, we've had an issue the past several election cycles getting enough poll workers to actually man all of the polls. How do you think it would work if we, did some sort of effort to allow people who have a job but would be willing to work the polls, some sort of leeway with their employers?
There may be some employers do that. I mean, it goes back to the whole, are you mandating something that the employer is doing? That could get us into something. I'll just tell you a few things. I think state employees can now be poll workers, which is a good thing. Also, what's in this legislation, and I don't really talk about it a lot, and I think it's in Manchin's compromise too, is making Election Day a national holiday. And we don't talk about it a lot. Why? Because it's already a state holiday here. It's like, that's a no-brainer. And I do remember as Secretary of State and going to these national conferences and having discussions and debates with fellow secretaries and fellow election administrators, and they're like, we just can't get places. And that's what county clerks have this troublesome. We just can't get places to have a precinct open. Well, and we would always be like, well, we have places, we just use schools. And they're like, but our schools are in session. And that's like, oh yeah, we're a state holiday. So that's one help that could be. So a teacher could be a poll worker, a state employee. Here's what I tried to do when I got in. I wanted, sometimes civic organizations, I always hope that civic organizations would say, okay, Rotary Kiwanis members, we're going to you volunteer, but you get paid to be a poll worker, and then let's donate it back to our club. Well, I wanted them to be able to donate it back to our club tax-free. You see what no, not the donation wouldn't be tax-free, because it is already tax-free, right? You can already write it off. How was I thinking about doing that? Just making it, or making, if they intended, I don't know how the language was written, if they intended it, it wouldn't be taxed. So some kind of incentive there in trying to get poll workers. It's interesting. I was on a conference, I was at a conference, and there were more poll workers available. Like during COVID this year, or 2020, election officials had enough poll workers because that became part of a country, a national effort to get people to be poll workers. I don't know what a business can do. I can't dictate to them to say, let 3 of your 4 employees go. I don't think that's maybe a good thing. I mean, you can, I just always think there's different ways to approach poll work. Like I've always thought about even split shifts. We know that we have a lot of our older seasoned citizens who are poll workers. They can do that early morning shift. Well, then why not get in the college students and the young professionals for the second half of the shift? I always thought that would be, it's hard though, because then you need 2 people for that one spot.
Yeah, it is a long day.
Yeah, it is a long day. Well, that's what I'm thinking. And it's like, this is where citizens can help solve the problem too. What would they be able to do? Would they be able to come in? In some counties, all counties pay. Some pay more than others. But, you get paid for training and you get paid for being there that day. College kid could use $100 for a day's work. That's for sure.
I could have. I remember those days.
But Jennifer, maybe back in our time, it would have been $100.
Yeah, probably not.
But still, 50 at that time would have been great.
Yeah.
So is there something that we as voters should be doing to, help protect our voting rights? Help
Yes.
get this stuff passed?
Yes, I mean, it's always about making phone calls, and it's interesting. I hear Senator Manchin. I heard him speak at the Marion County Chamber of Commerce. Jennifer, you and I heard him speak at Racine. And what's he talk about? Go and tell, like, because the coal miners physically went to save their pensions and their health care. They physically went to DC, and he's like, yes, I'm all for that. And it's like, yes, Senator, that's exactly what we're doing for voting rights. I mean, we've had event, you know, the advocacy groups have had events week in and week out, and there are thousands and thousands of phone calls being made, and they do make a difference. Sometimes people are like, yeah, when the person answered the phone, they weren't too interested there, and you know, like, yeah, they know. Senator Manchin knows, especially, and Capito needs to be called too, because, you know, and rightfully, Senator Manchin is trying to find, he's got the compromise, he wants bipartisan support. Why wouldn't Shelley Moore Capito be on this? Like, some of her amendments passed, they were embraced and passed, and Senator Klobuchar co-sponsored an amendment with Capito. And it's like, so why are you playing this game over here? But let's just get right out in front. She voted to even debate it. Why wouldn't we debate it? Up or down, yes or no, good or bad ideas. She didn't even want to debate it, just silenced everyone. But she's one who could really, I mean, imagine the support that she could give Senator Manchin. So call Senator Capito, call Senator Manchin, and it's not too late. It's very important. Show up at some rallies and events that take place. Those are things that you can do, Kim. I mean, they're so important. Show up at the redistricting meeting on Thursday.
Well, it sounds like we've got our marching orders. So with that, Kim and I would like to thank you for taking the time to talk to us today, and for all of your hard work and advocacy over the years, for your service to the state of West Virginia, then and now and in the future. Voting is such an important duty of the American citizenry, and one that we should value and take very seriously. And I look forward to the progress that we can make as a country toward making voting an easier and more equitable process for everybody. Thanks so much.
Well said.